Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a poor woodcutter and his two children, a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. Times were tough and the family struggled to make ends meet, often going hungry for days on end. Stress made the children's stepmother prone to fits of rage. The stepmother was not always cruel to her stepchildren. In fact, she had tried her best to care for them and treat them as her own. But as the village's economic situation worsened, she became increasingly desperate and consumed by her own fears. She saw her own children becoming thinner and weaker each day and worried that they too would soon fall victim to hunger. The thought of losing her own flesh and blood was too much to bear, and in her desperation, she decided to sacrifice her stepchildren in the hopes of saving her own. The stepmother's guilt and shame over her actions consumed her, and she could not bear to face her husband or the other villagers. She isolated herself in their small hut and refused to leave, consumed by her own misery and regret. One day, the woodcutter's wife had had enough of their poverty and decided to take matters into her own hands. She convinced her husband to take the children deep into the forest and leave them there to fend for themselves. The woodcutter was hesitant at first, but his wife's constant nagging and the fear of starving to death finally got the better of him. So, on a dark and stormy night, the woodcutter led Hansel and Gretel deep into the forest and abandoned them. The children cried and begged their father to take them back home, but he refused and left them alone in the wilderness. Hansel and Gretel were scared and alone, but they didn't give up hope. They searched for food and shelter, surviving on berries and mushrooms and drinking water from streams. Eventually, they came across a clearing with a strange-looking house made entirely of gingerbread and candy. In the town, there had been whispers and rumors of witch in the woods. According to the villagers, the witch had lived in the forest for as long as anyone could remember. She was said to be a former resident of the village who had been banished from the community for practicing dark magic and consorting with evil spirits. Legend had it that the witch's obsession with cannibalism had started many years ago when she was still a young woman. Her family had fallen on hard times, and she had resorted to stealing food from her neighbors to survive. One day, she was caught in the act by a group of angry villagers who beat her and left her for dead. In her rage and desperation, the young woman had made a deal with a powerful demon in exchange for revenge against those who had wronged her. The demon granted her wish but cursed her with an insatiable hunger for human flesh, which could only be satisfied by eating the young and innocent. The witch had built her gingerbread house in the forest as a lure for unsuspecting children, and over the years, she had captured and devoured dozens of them. She was said to be immortal, able to regenerate any wounds and heal any sickness by consuming the flesh of the young. The villagers lived in fear of the witch and warned their children never to stray too far into the forest. They believed that the witch's curse had spread to the very trees and animals of the forest, and that anyone who dared to enter her domain would be cursed as well. Despite their fears, the villagers also believed that the witch could be defeated with the help of a hero brave enough to face her. They told tales of a legendary hero who would one day rise up to vanquish the witch and free the children she had captured. But as the years passed, the tales of the hero grew fainter, and the witch's grip on the forest and the hearts of the villagers grew stronger. And so, the legend of the witch lived on, a warning to all who would dare to tempt fate and venture into the darkness of the forest. Hansel and Gretel had heard the tales just as all the children of the village had for generations. And just like the rest of the children, the brother and sister had never believed the legends. Yet, there they stood, in front of the odd cottage which looked like it had fallen out of the pages of a fairy tale. Hansel and Gretel were too hungry and exhausted to even consider the rumors of the townsfolk. The children rushed towards the house, but as they approached, the front door creaked open by itself. They cautiously stepped inside, and to their surprise, they found the interior of the house was even more magnificent than the exterior. The walls were made of sugar glass, the floors were made of gingerbread, and the furniture was made of candy. But the children soon realized that something wasn't right. The air was thick with the scent of rotting flesh, and they could hear strange noises coming from the back of the house. As they made their way towards the source of the sound, they discovered a room filled with human bones and skulls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and an old hag appeared from the shadows.
"Welcome, my dear children,"
she said with a sinister smile.
"I've been expecting you."
Hansel and Gretel were frozen with fear as the old hag approached them. She revealed herself to be a witch who had been luring children into her house for years, using the sweet smell of her gingerbread to attract them. She would then capture them, cook them in her oven, and feast on their flesh. The witch locked Hansel in a cage and forced Gretel to work as her servant, making her prepare meals for her and tend to her needs. Every day, the witch would come and check on Hansel, feeling his skin to see if he was plump enough to cook. But Hansel was smart and managed to trick the witch by using a chicken bone to make her think he was still skinny. Meanwhile, Gretel was slowly but surely hatching a plan to save her brother and escape the witch's clutches. One day, while the witch was sleeping, Gretel sneaked into her room and stole the key to Hansel's cage. She set him free, and together they overpowered the witch and locked her in the oven. As they ran out of the house, they heard the witch's screams as she burned to death. They ran through the forest until they reached their village, where their father was waiting for them with open arms. He had regretted abandoning them and had spent every day since searching for them. The family was reunited, but the memories of their ordeal would haunt them forever. The stepmother's actions had disastrous consequences, not only for her stepchildren but also for herself. The guilt and shame of what she had done haunted her until the end of her days, and her name became a curse in the village, spoken only in hushed whispers. After being reunited with his children, the father was consumed by rage and grief. He confronted her in their hut, and in a moment of madness, he strangled her to death. The father was beside himself with guilt and despair, but he knew he had to protect Hansel and Gretel from ever being harmed again, and the other dangers of the forest. Not to mention, if his crimes were discovered in the village, he would surely lose them once again. He packed some supplies and took his children on the run, leaving the village and the horrors they had faced behind. 4 days they traveled through the forest, with the father constantly looking over his shoulder and Hansel and Gretel clinging to him for safety. They faced hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but the father was determined to keep his children alive. Finally, after many days of wandering, they stumbled upon a small cottage deep in the woods. The owner of the cottage, an old woman, took pity on them and allowed them to stay, providing them with food and shelter. Over time, the father and his children began to heal from the traumas they had faced. Hansel and Gretel were able to put the horrors of the witch and their stepmother behind them, and the father found solace in the love and companionship of his children. Years passed, and the family lived in peace and harmony in their forest home. They were never able to return to their old life in the village, but they had found a new sense of purpose and belonging in the solitude of the woods. And so, the tale of Hansel and Gretel had a bittersweet ending, filled with tragedy and loss, but also with hope and the resilience of the human spirit.